Olivia Carter had always believed in the small mercies of routine. Every morning at 6:15, she woke to the sound of Derek's alarm buzzing from his side of the bed. By 6:30, she was downstairs brewing coffee in the kitchen of their modest 2-story home on Maple Street, a quiet residential road in Ashford, North Carolina, where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were supposed to be impossible. The house smelled like vanilla candles and old wood, a scent she had grown to associate with safety. Derek would come down by 7, hair still damp from the shower, kiss her on the forehead without looking her in the eyes, and leave for the hardware store he managed on the edge of town. She taught English at Ashford High School, where she had once been a student herself. Her life was small, predictable, and she had convinced herself that predictability was the same as happiness. But that autumn, something began to shift. It was nothing she could name at first, just a feeling that clung to her like humidity before a storm. Derek started coming home later, claiming inventory issues or staff problems. He smelled different too, not of sweat and lumber like he used to, but of something floral and unfamiliar. When she asked him about it, he laughed and said the store had started selling scented candles near the register. She believed him because she wanted to, because disbelief required energy she did not have. Her younger sister, Amanda, had moved in with them 3 months earlier, fresh from a divorce that had left her hollowed out and broke. Amanda was 29, 5 years younger than Olivia, with the kind of restless beauty that made people look twice. She had always been the dramatic one, the one who felt everything too much, while Olivia had been the steady older sister, the one who fixed things quietly. Amanda slept in the guest room at the end of the hall and spent her days looking for work, scrolling through her phone with a distant expression that Olivia recognized as grief. Olivia had offered her a place without hesitation. Family was family, and Amanda needed her. The three of them fell into a rhythm. Dinner at 7. Amanda would set the table while Olivia cooked. Derek would sit at the head of the table and talk about his day, but Olivia noticed he directed most of his words toward Amanda now. He laughed louder at her jokes. He refilled her wine glass before Olivia's. Once, Olivia caught them standing too close in the kitchen, Amanda's hand on Derek's arm, as she whispered something that made him grin. When Olivia walked in, they stepped apart like teenagers caught smoking. Amanda smiled brightly and said she had been asking Derek to help her move a box. Olivia nodded and said nothing, but that night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Derek's steady breathing beside her and wondering when she had become a stranger in her own home. She told herself she was imagining things. Stress did that. Work had been exhausting, her students more distracted than usual, and she had been sleeping poorly for weeks. But the details kept piling up. Derek's phone was always face down now. Amanda started wearing perfume to bed. The two of them had inside jokes Olivia was not part of. One evening, she found a receipt in Derek's jacket pocket from a restaurant she had never been to, dated on a Thursday when he said he had been working late. When she asked him about it, he said he had grabbed takeout with a coworker. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to so badly that she folded the receipt in half and threw it away, and never mentioned it again. But the feeling remained, growing heavier each day, like a stone she carried in her chest. It happened on a Tuesday in late October. Olivia woke that morning with a fever, her body aching and her throat raw. She had planned to push through the day, but by third period she was shivering so hard that the school nurse sent her home. She texted Derek to let him know, but he did not reply. She drove home slowly, her hands trembling on the wheel. The world outside blurred and too bright. When she pulled into the driveway at 1:30 in the afternoon, she noticed Amanda's car parked at an odd angle, as if it had been left in a hurry. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was silent, too silent. No television murmuring from the living room, no music drifting from upstairs. Olivia set her bag down on the kitchen counter and called out, but no one answered. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight, her breath shallow and uneven. The bedroom door at the end of the hall was halfway open, and through the gap she could see movement, shadows shifting against the afternoon light filtering through the curtains. She stopped. Her hand hovered over the doorframe. She did not want to look. Some part of her already knew, but she looked anyway. Derek was on their bed, the one with the quilted headboard she had picked out at a yard sale 5 years ago. Amanda was beneath him, her hair spread across the pillow, her hands on his back. They did not see her at first. Olivia stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to make sense of what her eyes were showing her. This was her bed, her husband, her sister. The room smelled like sex and betrayal, and for a moment she thought she might vomit. Then Amanda's eyes opened and met hers, and everything stopped. Amanda gasped. Derek turned. His face went white. Olivia did not scream. She did not cry. She took one step backward, and her shoulder hit the doorframe. A ceramic vase on the hallway table tipped over and shattered on the hardwood floor, the sound sharp and final. Derek scrambled off the bed, pulling on his jeans, saying her name over and over like a prayer. Amanda sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, her mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. Olivia turned and walked back down the stairs. She heard Derek behind her, his voice rising, pleading, but the words did not reach her. She picked up her keys from the counter. She walked out the front door. She got in her car. She drove. She did not know where she was going. She just drove, her hands gripping the wheel, her vision tunneling. She ended up at the edge of town, in the parking lot of an abandoned grocery store. And she sat there for 2 hours, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed over and over. Derek. Amanda. Derek again. She turned it off. When the sun started to set, she drove to a motel on the highway, paid cash for a room, and locked herself inside. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ugly floral wallpaper, and she realized she did not feel anything at all. Not anger, not sadness, just a vast, hollow emptiness, as if someone had reached inside her chest and scooped out everything that mattered. Olivia found an apartment 3 days later, a cramped one-bedroom above a coffee shop called Brewed Awakening on the south end of Ashford. The place smelled like burnt espresso and old grease, and the floorboards creaked when she walked. But it was hers, and hers alone. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Pemberton, with silver hair and kind eyes, did not ask questions when Olivia showed up with 2 suitcases and cash for the first month's rent. She just handed over the keys and said the coffee shop opened at 6 if Olivia ever needed company. Olivia nodded and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, her legs heavy as concrete. She had gone back to the house on Maple Street only once, on a Thursday afternoon when she knew Derek would be at work. Amanda's car was gone. The house looked the same from the outside, neat and unremarkable. But when Olivia walked through the front door, she felt like she was trespassing in someone else's life. She moved quickly, methodically, packing her clothes into garbage bags, grabbing her books and her laptop and the framed photo of her mother that sat on her nightstand. She left everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the wedding album tucked in the closet, the bed. She could not bring herself to touch the bed. On her way out, she saw the floral dress she had been wearing that day still hanging on the clothesline in the backyard, swaying gently in the October breeze. She left it there. She never wanted to see it again. At school, she became a ghost. Her colleagues noticed the change immediately. Olivia had always been warm, the kind of teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, who organized book drives and bake sales. Now she arrived exactly on time, taught her classes with mechanical precision, and left the moment the final bell rang. She ate lunch alone in her classroom, door closed, blinds drawn. When the other teachers invited her to happy hour or asked if she was okay, she smiled tightly and said she was fine, just tired. They stopped asking after a while. The nights were the worst. She would sit by the window of her apartment with a mug of tea that went cold in her hands, watching the street below. Ashford was the kind of town where people walked their dogs at dusk and couples held hands on their way to dinner. She watched them and felt nothing, as if she were separated from the world by a pane of glass she could not break through. Her phone stayed off for the first week. When she finally turned it on, there were 43 missed calls from Derek and 16 text messages. She read the first one. "Olivia, please let me explain." She deleted the rest without reading them and blocked his number. Amanda tried too. A handwritten letter arrived at the school, delivered by a student Olivia did not recognize. The envelope was pink, Amanda's favorite color, and Olivia's name was written in her sister's looping cursive. Olivia held it for a long time, standing in the empty hallway after classes had ended, staring at the familiar handwriting. Then she walked to the teacher's lounge, held the letter over the trash can, and lit it with a match from the emergency kit. She watched it burn, the edges curling black, the ink disappearing into ash. She did not cry. She had not cried once since that Tuesday afternoon. It was as if something inside her had shut down completely. A circuit breaker flipped to protect what little remained. She went to work. She came home. She sat by the window. She slept in fragments, waking at 3 a.m. to stare at the ceiling and wonder how she had become this person, this hollow version of herself. Some mornings she stood in the shower until the water ran cold, her forehead pressed against the tile, trying to remember what it felt like to want something, anything, but there was only the emptiness, vast and unrelenting, and the terrible certainty that she would feel this way forever. 3 months passed. Winter settled over Ashford, turning the streets gray and brittle. Olivia moved through her days like a sleepwalker, performing the motions of living without actually feeling alive. But routine, she discovered, had a strange power. It kept her upright when everything else had collapsed. On a Saturday morning in early January, she walked to the public library on Chestnut Street, a small brick building with tall windows and the faint smell of old paper. She needed books for her students, something to anchor the upcoming unit on American poetry, and the school's collection was sparse. The library was nearly empty, just a few elderly patrons reading newspapers near the radiators, and a young mother with a toddler in the children's section. Olivia wandered through the aisles, running her fingers along the spines of books, the familiar weight of literature grounding her in a way nothing else could. She was reaching for a copy of Leaves of Grass when she heard a voice behind her, low and careful. "Olivia Carter?" She turned. For a moment she did not recognize him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and a face that looked like it had been carved from something solid and dependable. Then it clicked. Ethan Lawson. She had not seen him in years, not since high school, though she remembered him vaguely as the quiet kid who sat in the back of her algebra class, always sketching buildings in the margins of his notebook. He had been a few years ahead of her, graduated when she was still a sophomore, and then he had disappeared into whatever life people lived when they stayed in small towns but kept to themselves. "Ethan," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, like she had forgotten how to speak to people who were not her students. He smiled, a small, crooked thing that did not ask for anything in return. "It's been a while." He was holding a thick book on architectural design, his hands large and calloused, the kind of hands that built things. "You still teaching at the high school?" She nodded. "English. You?" "Carpentry. Freelance work, mostly. Renovations, custom furniture, that kind of thing." He glanced at the book in her hands. "Whitman?" "For class." They stood there in the quiet of the library, and Olivia realized she did not feel the usual urge to escape. Ethan did not look at her with pity or curiosity. He did not ask where she had been, or why she looked so tired. He just stood there, solid and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. "I was about to grab coffee," he said after a moment, his tone casual but his eyes careful. "The place across the street. My last project wrapped up early, and I've got an hour to kill before the next one. You want to join?" Olivia hesitated. Every instinct told her to say no, to retreat back into the safety of her isolation. But there was something about the way he asked, without expectation or pressure, that made her pause, and beneath the numbness, buried so deep she had almost forgotten it existed, was a flicker of something that might have been loneliness. "Okay," she said. They walked across the street to a small diner called Rosie's, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that only played songs from the 70s. Ethan ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie. Olivia ordered tea she did not drink. They sat by the window, and he talked about his work, about a house he was restoring on the outskirts of town, about the satisfaction of sanding wood until it was smooth as glass. He did not ask about her life, and she was grateful for that. When the hour was up, he paid the bill, waved off her protest, and walked her back to her car. "See you around, Olivia," he said, and then he was gone, walking down the street with his hands in his pockets and his book tucked under his arm. She sat in her car for a long time after that, staring at the library across the street, and realized that for the first time in 3 months, she had felt something other than emptiness. It was small, fragile, barely there at all, but it was something. Spring came to Ashford in fits and starts, cold mornings giving way to mild afternoons that smelled like wet earth and new grass. Olivia had started to believe that she might actually be okay, that the weight she had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift. She and Ethan had settled into something that felt less like dating and more like two people learning to exist in the same space without hurting each other. There were no grand declarations, no promises made in the heat of emotion. Just steady, quiet presence, coffee on Sunday mornings, long drives through the countryside with the windows down, the kind of intimacy that built itself slowly, brick by brick, until one day Olivia looked up and realized she had stopped flinching every time he reached for her hand. But in early April, she got sick. It started as a tickle in her throat on a Monday morning, the kind of thing she would have ignored under normal circumstances. But by Tuesday evening, she was feverish and aching, her body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that made even lifting her head feel impossible. She called in sick to work on Wednesday, something she almost never did, and spent the day curled under a blanket on her couch, drifting in and out of sleep. She did not call Ethan. She had learned a long time ago not to burden people with her needs, not to ask for help when she could suffer through it alone. But Ethan had a way of knowing things without being told. On Wednesday afternoon, there was a knock on her door. Olivia dragged herself off the couch, her legs unsteady, and opened it to find him standing there with a canvas grocery bag in one hand and a folded quilt in the other. He took one look at her, pale and shivering in an oversized sweater, and frowned. "You look terrible," he said, not unkindly. "Thanks," she croaked. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, setting the bag on the small kitchen counter and the quilt on the back of the couch. "Homemade chicken soup," he said, pulling out a large thermos. "My mom's recipe, and some cold medicine, tea, honey, the works." He glanced at her, his expression soft. "When's the last time you ate?" Olivia tried to remember and could not. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Ethan just shook his head and set about heating the soup on her stove, moving through her tiny kitchen like he had been there 100 times before. He made her sit on the couch, wrapped the quilt around her shoulders, and brought her a bowl of soup that smelled like comfort and childhood. She ate slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest, and watched him settle into the armchair across from her with a book he had pulled from his jacket pocket. He did not hover. He did not fuss. He just sat there, reading quietly, his presence filling the small space in a way that did not feel intrusive. Olivia fell asleep on the couch sometime around 6, the empty bowl still on the coffee table. And when she woke hours later, the apartment was dark except for the soft glow of the lamp beside Ethan's chair. He was still there, his book open in his lap, his reading glasses perched crookedly on his nose. He had not left. He had stayed, even though she had not asked him to. Even though there was nothing exciting or romantic about watching someone sleep off a fever, he had just stayed. She watched him for a long time. This man who had appeared in her life when she had given up on the idea of being seen, and something inside her shifted. It was not dramatic. There were no fireworks, no sudden realizations, just a quiet certainty settling into her bones like rain soaking into dry ground. This was love, not the kind that announced itself with grand gestures or sweeping promises, not the kind that demanded anything in return, just presence, just showing up, just being there when it mattered, even when it was hard or boring or inconvenient. Ethan looked up then, as if he had felt her watching, and their eyes met across the dim room. He smiled, small and tired, and closed his book. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, and she meant it in more ways than one. He stood and stretched, his joints cracking softly. "Good. I'll get out of your hair. Let you sleep." "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He paused, halfway to the door, and turned back to look at her. She wanted to tell him what she had realized, wanted to put into words the gratitude and the fear and the fragile hope that had taken root in her chest, but the words felt too big, too unwieldy. So instead she just said, "Thank you for staying." He nodded, his expression gentle. "Anytime, Olivia. I mean that." And when he left, closing the door softly behind him, Olivia lay back down on the couch and pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. It smelled like him, like sawdust and soap, and something warm she could not name. She closed her eyes and let herself believe just for a moment that maybe she deserved this. Maybe she deserved someone who stayed. It was late May when everything changed. The air had turned warm and thick. the kind of heat that made the evenings feel endless. Olivia had started spending more time at Ethan's workshop, a converted barn on the outskirts of town that smelled perpetually of fresh-cut wood and varnish. She liked it there. It was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty. The walls were lined with tools she did not know the names of, and there was always a project in progress, something half-finished that Ethan would sand or stain while they talked about nothing in particular. On this particular evening, Olivia was perched on a tall stool near the workbench, a mug of hot chocolate warming her hands despite the season. Ethan was across from her, working on a dining table commissioned by a family in the next town over. He was sanding the surface with long, methodical strokes, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a light sheen of sweat on his forehead. The radio in the corner played something low and instrumental, and the only other sound was the rhythmic whisper of sandpaper against wood. Olivia had been watching him for the better part of an hour, not saying much, just content to be there. There was something hypnotic about the way he worked, the care he took with every motion, the way he paused occasionally to run his hand over the wood, checking for imperfections she could not see. She thought about how different this was from her marriage to Derek, where love had been loud and performative, full of grand gestures that never quite meant what they were supposed to. With Ethan, love was quiet. It was showing up. It was sanding a table until it was perfect because someone was paying him to care. It was bringing soup when she was sick. It was staying. And then, without looking up from his work, Ethan said, "I'm in love with you, Olivia." The words hung in the air between them, simple and unadorned. He did not stop sanding. He did not look at her, as if he knew that making it into a moment would give her a chance to run. Olivia's breath caught, her hands tightening around the mug. She had known this was coming, had felt it building for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like stepping off a cliff. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan continued, his voice calm and measured. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know." Olivia set the mug down on the workbench, her hands trembling slightly. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words tangled in her throat. What could she say? That she was terrified? That every instinct told her to protect herself, to keep her heart locked away where no one could reach it? That she wanted to believe him but did not know if she was capable of trusting anyone ever again? Instead, she said nothing. She just sat there, staring at him, and he let her. He did not push. He did not demand a response. He just kept working, his hands steady and sure, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was patient. It was kind. Days passed. A week. Olivia could not stop thinking about what he had said, the weight of those words pressing against her ribs every time she saw him. They continued as they had before, but something had shifted. She found herself watching him more closely, noticing the way he always made sure her coffee was exactly the way she liked it, the way he listened when she talked about her students, the way he never asked her to be anything other than what she was. And then, on a warm evening in early June, they were walking through the town square, the sky turning shades of pink and gold as the sun set behind the old courthouse. The square was mostly empty, just a few people walking their dogs, and a couple sitting on a bench near the fountain. Olivia and Ethan had been talking about something inconsequential, a movie they both wanted to see, when Olivia suddenly stopped walking. Ethan turned to look at her, concern flickering across his face. "You okay?" She took a breath, her heart pounding so hard she thought he might hear it. "I love you too," she said, the words coming out quieter than she intended. "I'm terrified, and I don't know if I'm any good at this, but I love you." Ethan did not smile triumphantly or pull her into a dramatic embrace. He just nodded, his expression soft and steady, and reached for her hand. "That's enough," he said simply. "That's more than enough." They stood there in the fading light, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Olivia was not afraid. A year passed like water flowing over stones, reshaping everything it touched. Olivia moved out of the apartment above the coffee shop in September, not because she had to, but because Ethan asked her to move in with him. The house he had been restoring on the edge of town was finally finished, a 2-story craftsman with wide porches and windows that let in so much light it felt like living inside a sun-drenched dream. He had built much of it with his own hands, and Olivia could see him in every corner, in the smooth banister he had sanded for weeks, in the kitchen cabinets with their hand-carved pulls, in the bedroom with its vaulted ceiling and exposed beams. When he showed her the house for the first time, complete and furnished, he had taken her to a room on the second floor that faced east, where morning light poured through tall windows. The walls were painted a soft cream, and in the center of the room sat a sturdy wooden table he had built specifically for her, its surface wide and smooth, perfect for spreading out papers or books or whatever she needed. "I thought you could use this for a studio," he said quietly, watching her face. "For painting, or writing, or just thinking, whatever you want." Olivia had stood there, her throat tight, staring at the table and the easel he had set up in the corner, and the shelves waiting to be filled. She had not painted since college, had abandoned it the same way she had abandoned so many parts of herself when she married Derek, when she had tried to fit into a life that was too small for her. But Ethan remembered. He had asked her once, months ago, what she used to do before teaching consumed all her time, and she had mentioned painting almost as an afterthought. He had remembered, and he had built her a space to reclaim it. She moved in 2 weeks later, and the house became theirs. They did not rush into marriage. There were no proposals or grand gestures, no need to prove anything to anyone. They simply lived, building a life together with the same care Ethan used when working with wood. Each day, another layer of trust and intimacy added to the foundation. Olivia started painting again, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. She painted the view from the window, the way the light changed throughout the day, the trees that lined the property. Ethan would come up after work, smelling like sawdust and sweat, and stand behind her, his chin resting on her shoulder, and they would look at what she had created without him needing to say anything at all. At school, people noticed the change. Olivia smiled more. She stayed late again, but now it was because she wanted to, not because she had nowhere else to go. She organized a poetry reading for her students and started a book club that met twice a month. She laughed in the teacher's lounge. She made plans. She existed in the world again, not as a ghost passing through, but as someone who had earned her place in it. One afternoon in late October, almost exactly a year after she had seen Derek and Amanda in the grocery store, Olivia ran into Derek on Main Street. She was coming out of the bakery with a loaf of sourdough bread, and he was walking toward her, alone. For a moment, they just stared at each other. He looked older, she thought. Tired. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there before, and his shoulders sagged in a way that suggested the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. "Olivia," he said, his voice tentative. She stopped, more out of surprise than courtesy. "Derek, He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I heard you're doing well. Living out on Willow Road." "I am. That's good. That's really good." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I wanted to say, I know it doesn't matter now, but I'm sorry. For everything. I was a coward, and I hurt you, and I'm sorry." Olivia looked at him, this man who had once been the center of her universe, and felt nothing. Not anger, not bitterness, not even pity, just a quiet indifference, the kind that comes when someone who once mattered becomes a stranger again. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it. "I hope you're happy, Derek. I really do." He nodded, his eyes searching her face for something he would not find. "Are you happy?" Olivia smiled, and it was genuine. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." She walked past him, the bread warm in her hands, and did not look back. When she got home, Ethan was in the kitchen making dinner, pasta with vegetables from the garden he had planted in the spring. He looked up when she came in, his face lighting up in that way that still made her chest tighten. "How was your day?" he asked. "Good," she said, setting the bread on the counter and crossing to him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Really good. It was a Sunday evening in November, the kind of evening where the air turned cold and sharp, and the sky faded from blue to violet to black in the span of an hour. Olivia and Ethan sat on the front porch of their house, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the sun disappear behind the line of trees at the edge of their property. A mug of tea sat forgotten on the small table between them, steam curling into the chilly air. Ethan had his arm around her shoulders, and Olivia leaned into him, her body fitting against his like it had always belonged there. They did not talk much. They rarely needed to anymore. The silence between them was full, rich with understanding and shared history, with all the things they had been through separately and together. Olivia thought about the woman she had been a year and a half ago, hollow and broken, sitting alone in a dingy apartment above a coffee shop and wondering if she would ever feel whole again. She thought about the bed she had left behind, the house on Maple Street, the sister who had betrayed her, the husband who had chosen someone else. She thought about all the ways her life could have gone, all the versions of herself she might have become if she had made different choices, if she had stayed, if she had never walked into that library on a cold January morning. But she had walked into that library. She had said yes to coffee. She had let Ethan in, slowly and carefully, one small gesture at a time, until the walls she had built around herself had crumbled, and she had found herself standing in the rubble, terrified and hopeful and alive. And now she was here, in a house filled with light, with a man who loved her, not because she was perfect, but because she was real, with a life she had built from the ashes of the old one. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, his voice soft against her hair. Olivia was quiet for a moment, trying to find the words. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "that if none of it had happened, if Derek hadn't left, if Amanda hadn't—" She stopped, shook her head. "I'd still be in that house, still pretending I was happy, still living a life that was never really mine." Ethan did not say anything, just tightened his arm around her. "I'm not saying I'm glad it happened," Olivia continued. "It almost destroyed me, but it also set me free. And I think," her voice caught, and she took a breath, "I think maybe I needed to break before I could become who I was supposed to be." Ethan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You didn't break," he said quietly. "You bent. There's a difference." Olivia closed her eyes and let herself feel it all, the grief and the gratitude, the pain and the peace. She thought about how strange it was, how the worst thing that had ever happened to her had also led her to the best, how betrayal had opened a door she never knew existed, how love, real love, was not about fireworks or grand gestures, but about showing up, day after day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The last of the sunlight faded, and the stars began to appear, pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. Olivia and Ethan sat there together, wrapped in the blanket, and watched the world settle into night. And for the first time in her life, Olivia felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. If this story touched something in you, if you believe that even the deepest wounds can heal, that endings can become beginnings, that the people who break us are sometimes the ones who set us free, then stay with us. Subscribe, because every story we share is a reminder that no matter how dark it gets, there is always light waiting on the other side. And maybe, just maybe, your story is only beginning too.